If you're still struggling with consent, just imagine instead of initiating sex, you're making them a cup of tea. You say, hey, would you like a cup of tea? And they go, oh my God, fuck yes, I would fucking love a cup of tea, thank you. Then you know they want a cup of tea. If you say, hey, would you like a cup of tea? And they're like, I'm not really sure. Then you could make them a cup of tea, or not, but be aware they might not drink it. And if they don't drink it, then, and this is the important part, don't make them drink it. Just because you made it doesn't mean you are entitled to watch them drink it. And if they say no thank you, then don't make them tea. At all. Just don't make them tea. Don't make them drink tea. Don't get annoyed at them for not wanting tea. They just don't want tea, okay? They might say, yes, please. That's kind of you. And then when the tea arrives, they actually don't want the tea at all. Sure, that's kind of annoying as you've gone to all the effort of making the tea, but they remain under no obligation to drink the tea. They did want tea, now they don't. Some people change their mind in the time that it takes to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk. And it's okay for people to change their mind. And you are still not entitled to watch them drink it. And if they're unconscious, don't make them tea. Unconscious people don't want tea. And they can't answer the question, do you want tea? Because they're unconscious. Okay, maybe they were conscious when you asked them if they wanted tea. And they said yes. But in the time it took you to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk, they are now unconscious. You should just put the tea down. Make sure the unconscious person is safe. And this is the important part again. Don't make them drink the tea. They said yes then, sure, but unconscious people don't want tea. If someone said yes to tea, started drinking it, and then passed out before they'd finished it, don't keep on pouring it down their throat. Take the tea away. Make sure they're safe, because unconscious people don't want tea. Trust me on this. If someone said yes to tea around your house last Saturday, that doesn't mean they want you to make them tea all the time. They don't want you to come around to their place unexpectedly and make them tea and force them to drink it going, but you wanted tea last week. Or to wake up to find you pouring tea down their throat going, but you wanted tea last night. If you can understand how completely ludicrous it is to force people to have tea when they don't want tea, and you're able to understand when people don't want tea, then how hard is it to understand it when it comes to sex? Whether it's tea or sex, consent is everything. And on that note, I'm going to go make myself a cup of tea.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Norway House. After such a long time with COVID-19, I'm very pleased to be able to host this physically this year. It is a pleasure for me to welcome you all, as I said, to the Nordic Breakfast Discussion on Women's Day. Thank you for joining us here. A special thanks to our panelists and the moderator, needless to say. The Nordic Breakfast Discussion has been hosted by the Nordic countries and embassies since 2016. Each year we arrange a panel on Women's Day to discuss gender equality and anti-discrimination. The aim is to address challenges and share values and perspectives. I believe it is even more important to keep up this tradition this year. We are witnessing a terrible and destructive war in Ukraine. Gender equality and non-discrimination is about meeting everyone with the same opportunity, the same respect, and the same dignity. Violence and war are exactly the opposite. It is highly destructive and degrading to everyone, women and men alike. We have a very important topic on the agenda today, consent law. Sexual violence is, as we all know, a major problem. The discussions here today is about whether consent law is a suitable and effective legal instrument for preventing and dealing with sexual violence. In the last couple of years, some Nordic countries, as Sweden and Denmark, I believe, have adopted consent law. Other countries like Norway, and Belgium for that matter, have not yet done so. However, it is a recurring issue in the public debate, in media, and in national parliaments. It would be of great interest to hear about experiences from Sweden and Denmark so far, and also about where discussions stand, more specifically, in other Nordic countries as well as in Belgium. I trust you all will find the debate meaningful and interesting. I will now give the floor to our moderator, Catherine van der Hoyning. She's a law professor at the University of Antwerp, Deputy Public Prosecutor at the Antwerp Public Ministry, and also a member of the UN Advisory Committee to the Human Rights Council. Please, Professor.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for this very nice introduction. So, if only consent were as easy as drinking tea. We all accept in our countries that consent is the basis, the cornerstone of sexual activities. However, in practice, it's often more difficult. And we even see our countries, which have a progressive approach to sexual activities and gender equality at the highest level in the world, still we are debating consent, and it turns out it's not that easy. We have a fantastic panel to be discussing consent. But for me, particularly at this moment, it's also very interesting because the Belgian Parliament has just finalized a draft that will finally include a definition of consent in the criminal code. So I think there's so much to learn from each other, and not just the law, which we will of course be discussing, but also culture, a culture of consent, and how to come about a culture of consent. So I'm very happy to introduce the panel. We're all very happy. It's again physical, and we also take the advantages of COVID or our COVID experiences in the sense that we're working hybrid today. So one of our panelists is online, and I'm very happy to start with Thorbjorg Gunnlaugsdottir, who is a member of parliament in Iceland. And she's also a previous colleague in the sense that she was a public prosecutor working on sex crimes. So, and in Parliament she has also been working on legislation concerning consent and sexual crimes. So she is the perfect person, of course, to have here to discuss also lawmaking as well, of how laws come about and what the role can be of politics to change consent culture. Then we have Jo Martin Stigen, law professor of the University of Oslo, who is specialized in international and domestic criminal law, who will then tell us about the lack of consent legislation in Norway and of the evolutions in Norway. So we already have the contrasting experiences of having legislation and not having that. Then I'm very happy to also introduce you to Turið Maria Jóhansdóttir from the Faroe Islands. She's the director of Amnesty International, and they are also working and really on the advocacy side as well of consent legislation. From already talking to her, I know that there's a lot of interesting evolution there as well on supporting victims, which of course is another element that we will be discussing. Then online we have Ida Östensson. She is the director, or she is the founder of FATA, which is a Swedish organization that was very pivotal in bringing about the legislation concerning consent in Sweden. I think that's also a very interesting experience. We will be talking about what I just mentioned, really to create a culture of consent, and that legislation can be important. But if we really want to make that people are not forced to drink the tea if they don't want to, you really need to start young. And there, on that perspective, Ida will certainly enlighten us. So thank you for all being here. And I think the first thing that we will be doing is stock taking. to get a good idea, because some of the evolution legislations are very well known because they're so exemplary, but some are less known. So first I'm going to give the word to every one of the speakers to just address, okay, how is consent today defined in your country? And what is really going on in terms of evolution? So what is the state of play at this moment concerning consent legislation and so for the definition of rape as well? Thorbjorg, I'm really happy to give you as first one the floor to introduce what the discussion is about in Iceland at the moment.
The discussion.
Or the consent, how consent is defined.
Yes. So in 2018, we changed our definition of rape in our criminal code, and now it's consent-based. We followed the Swedish model when writing, and that's also part of Iceland's legal history, strong history of good translations. But the discussion leading up to the change was not very long. The public discussion, it happened kind of quickly when it finally happened, I would say. But from a legal point of view, I took part in writing it. It was a former member of the political party I belonged to that introduced the bill in Parliament. And a happy side note is that this was a bill from a member of opposition. These bills do not become legislation all days. But here it was like a consensus within Parliament that this was a right and timely step to take. I was very happy to see it because I think consent will be vital when thinking of law as a tool to deal with crime, but also to prevent crime. That consent can be a strong tool for the discussion and on how to, prevent these crimes, hopefully. The prosecutor in me would say, is consent the magic solution? No, it is not. And of course, the former definition we had and the new one, I mean, these terms, they all interact. Coercion or force or violence, it violates autonomy and the right to decide, and the denial of self-determination is, of course, coercive in its sense. So these terms, they interact. When you're prosecuting or investigating a crime or rape, you are looking at all of these terms in order to prove what really happened. But I think we saw that law and views out in society is also a circle. You had the underlying atmosphere to implement this change with the laws, and then the laws also helped in the public discussion that followed. So there was a strong political support, there was a strong support among the public, and we've had it now, like I said, since 2018. And it has led to a more fruitful discussion on how we want to investigate, prosecute, and handle this case in a broader context, of course, related to the Me Too discussion that we all are familiar with here.
Very interesting, and because you mentioned the Swedish example, it's only natural that now I go to Ida to talk about the Swedish example. Ida, the Swedish debate concerning consent and how the law came about is very exemplary. So what is so particular about the consent, how consent now is defined in the Swedish legislation? And you can, of course, elaborate if you want at this point as well as to the campaign that has led up to the legislation that was passed.
Even though it's violent.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
You hear me? Yeah, great.
Yeah.
I said, thank you for letting me be a part of this panel discussion by link. And in the past, in Sweden, as in many other places in the world, we have shown that no means no. And that was also how our legislation was built, which is a useless thing to base a law on. And this is because research in Sweden showed that as many as 70% had some kind of freeze reaction, to become paralyzed in your body. So 7 out of 10 couldn't say no or couldn't even do any resistance. So then the law can't be based on that. So in July 2018, the law on rape was changed. So it is now based on the absence of consent rather than the occurrence of violence, threats of violence, or that the victim has to be in a particularly vulnerable situation. And also, according to the legal text, it says special consideration shall be given to whether voluntariness has been expressed by word or deed or by other means. So I would say we have gone from a no means no to anything but yes means no. And now we shift the perspective. So it's up to the person that wants to have sex to make sure that the other person wants as well. And also one important thing is that the consent have to be recent, and quote, before each new sexual act, a new expression is needed for participation to still be considered voluntary, like the film we just saw. Even though I say yes, to go home and do one thing, you have to also search for consent for the next thing. But also I have to say, even though we have this very good law and we are so proud of it, and it showed also when Brottsförebyggande rådet, I think it's like the Swedish Crime Prevention Council, they investigated the effect of the Consent Act in 2020, and it showed that the number of convictions had increased by 75%, and also those who have been abused take the blame less often and also report more. But we still have a very low clearance rate. Rape reports in recent years shows that only around 5 out of 100 reported rapes result in a conviction. And also if we put on the ones that don't report, is like 80 to 90%. So we have to continue to be critical and point out new developments in the law, and also how we tackle and prioritizing, like in the police, sexual offenses constantly. Okay. And I can talk, I don't know if you want me to do it on this now or later on. I had it later on to talk about how we worked for this.
Well, we'll come back to that as well. And then I'll proceed to the stock taking. Well, Norway, there's not so much to talk about the law as such, but I'll give you the floor.
Yes, currently in Norway there is a debate on this issue as to whether we should adopt a consent-based definition of rape. Of course, in Norway we have the same problem as Ida describes, that there are many rapes, there are not so many charges being pressed. There are even fewer indictments from the prosecutor, and there are very few convictions. And this is a huge problem, which is recognized by everybody. Actually, we changed our definition of rape in 2000, I think it was. So from a definition based on violence, the use of violence or threat of violence, we also included the situation where the victim is not able to resist. For instance, because of drugs, or a person is asleep. And then there was a huge discussion, because already then people said, but that is not rape. Because rape, actually, this has a lot to do with language. Because in Norway, rape is called voldtekt. Mm-hmm. And the word violence is actually part of the term. Mm-hmm. So I think people have difficulties, but that's not rape. Because everybody in Norway agrees that you should not have sex with somebody who does not consent. But it's not rape. People say, you're not a rapist. It's something else. You shouldn't do it, but it's not rape. So it's a weird discussion, actually. Everybody agrees it's wrong. Mm-hmm. And actually, we have a provision. It's not used so often, but it talks about sexual act. without consent, sexual act. And this is a typical Me Too provision, I would call it. And it has been used a lot after, when was it, 2017, 16, the start of the Me Too thing. It has been used, but only when people have, touched somebody without consent, but not intercourse. It is never used. So it's a huge discussion now, and I think it was very interesting to read the report from Sweden, which is very positive. And as a law professor working with criminal law, I think it's in the hands of the people or the parliament to define rape as we want to define it. And I found it very interesting to hear that there was a survey in schools, in high schools. So people around 17, 18 years would answer questions. And it turns out that around 70, 80% of all the students in schools consider having sex without consent to be rape. So I think this is has to do with bringing the legislation together with people's perception. So the law should reflect people's. But this provision that I'm talking about, it has a maximum prison of 1 year in prison, maximum punishment. But if you go to the rape provision, it has a maximum of 10, even 15 years. So there's a gap. There's a gap. So, and the first thing the new government after the election in September, last September, did was to appoint a committee who is now working. And in December, they will come up with a report or conclusion and advice as to whether we should change our legislation and define rape to be sex without consent.
Yes.
And I really do not know, but of course it's embarrassing to be here today, but because Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, Finland, not Belgium yet,
No.
they all have
Almost.
it. So Norway is not the best boy in class anymore on this topic, so to speak. Yeah.
Third, and then we of course we conclude with the Faroe Islands.
Yes, we in Amnesty started working on rape and consent in 2015. At that time, we focused on 5 different aspects of the issue. One of them was the legislation at that time, which was violence-based and super narrow, violence and penetration. The definition was of rape. 2 years later, it was changed to also include people who couldn't oppose to it of different reasons. And so it's still violence-based, but yesterday there was a proposal for a first reading ready, and this proposal is consent-based. More or less likely as in Sweden, but more similar to Danish law right now. So we have seen a big change happening, and in 2015 we also started on awareness campaigns, which we have done like every year since then. And 2 years ago we decided to start working on a consent-based law. We just started the campaign. We had one event, and then our Prime Minister was like, I'm going to do this. And now he had this draft ready, so it didn't take any of our energy to work for the consent-based law, or draft,
Yeah, because as you say very well, like the advocacy and Joe also hinted at that, so taking society along and making sure that legislation is not off what's in society. Ida, I'm very happy to give you the floor again, because what you did with Fata was a very good example how you can use advocacy not just to create legislation but also a consent culture. Do you want to expand on that?
The movement behind the consent law in Sweden, and just to be clear, today FATA is a non-profit organization that everyone who wants to get involved in the fight against sexual violence and for consent in practice and in law, that's how we talk about it. And the organization was first a campaign, and it started after 3 guys who had been accused of raping a girl with a glass bottle, and they were acquitted by the court. And in one of the articles about the case, it's included an extract, I think, from the sentencing, which read, "The fact that the girl had pressed her legs together could be interpreted as a sign of her being shy." And they also had a quote, "The boys stopped penetrating her with the bottle when she started bleeding. Hence, they may not have had malicious intent." Like pressing the legs together, 3 guys, 1 girl, and the court says it's her being shy and not a sign of no. It was just too much for us. And that was only one of many recent rape cases where the offenders had been cleared of all charges. So my organization, Make Equal, together with another organization called Fantastic, and Fantastic organize women in hip hop, R&B, reggae, soul, and urban culture. We decided to go together and start a campaign with clear-cut demands. It should be easy to sign up. And we were 25-year-old at that time when we started, and or like 25 to 27 or something. And we didn't know so much about this. But when we like saw all of these things happening, and that there were all so many cases that were clear of all charges, even though for us it was obviously rape, we just looked in the legislation and we saw that there was no demand of consent. And so we started to collect stories from people and their experiences. And that was before Me Too. So we got like over 100, and that was many at the time. And we decided to have the stories as our tool and our arguments. So the first 2 demands that we had in our first debate article was, we need to talk about consent as early as in preschools, and we need to change the sexual legislation to a consent-based law. And to reach as many people as possible, we brought together some of Sweden's best hip hop, soul, reggae artists to produce a song and a music video that based on all these stories that we collected. And we also wrote a debate article together with well-known people from the culture sector. We also have the professor of criminal law, politicians from right and left, staff from women's shelter. We wanted to show that this is a question for everyone. And then we released the song and the debate article at the same day in September in 2013. And we thought that that was the thing we're gonna do. And then we should go back to our regular jobs, but it just exploded. And it was so clear that we came at the right moments, at the right tone, used the right form of expressions, and not to mention had the right demands. So we reached the 2 goals that we had in the first debate article. We had made like fake tattoo campaigns with politicians, and also one of the party leaders even tattooed Fatta on his body, his first tattoo. And we had big shows with artists playing, and also big demonstrations. Like we combined culture and politics in a way that made consent sexy and relevant in a way. And now we fight to get consent in every room. We want everyone to get it. Fatta. This is also something we've done, a lot of jewelries and merch and stuff like that. We have like hundreds of thousands of people walking around with our merch, and people are like, okay, what is that? And it's a conversation starter, and they can talk about that we have over 100 rapes every day, and about the legislation. So now we work for a consent culture in whole society, and also Make Equal. I don't know if I'm going to say that now or later on, but that we also wrote a children's book about this to get it. If we're going to have this perspective for older people, that you have to search for a yes and not say no, we have to start early and not only learn kids to say stop and no.
Absolutely. One of the things that you touched and was already previously mentioned in a panel, we still have a huge dark number of people who have been raped or of experienced sexual violence but do not press charges. And if they press charges in the vast majority, it will end in not prosecuting or in a not guilty verdict. Thorbjorg, you have the both experiences, of course, as deputy prosecutor, but also now as a lawmaker, thinking how to overcome this. How do you see, what do you think can be vital actually to overcome this hurdle?
Although I am a lawyer, I don't think the law will be the solution there. Maybe that's a deadly sin for the lawyer to say. I think, like you mentioned, it's a part of our language and our culture, and in that regard, I think the law is definitely a vital part of the solution. For instance, that we are shifting from a focus of no means no to looking at yes. And I think, at least in Icelandic, we have the same problem with the word våldtäkt. Icelandic word is nauðgun, and in a cultural sense, that's a very vulgar crime. So the underlying theme, if you can say so, of rape is violence, coercion, physical coercion. These brutal circumstances that the daily rape reported police not necessarily reflects. So I think it's both relevant in investigations and prosecutions to shift the focus. That the discussion, investigation, and the whole approach is where did you see the yes in these circumstances, and in questioning both by police and by prosecution, it alters the discussion. The classic answer would be like, she didn't say no, and then it turns out she didn't say no, but she didn't say anything because she freezes. So then you can follow up on, but when did she say yes? How did you experience yes in these circumstances of a person not saying anything or being unconscious even, or these ridiculous scenarios where you still get the answer of she didn't say no. So I think this will be helpful both in changing views within society. But I've also noticed, and it's not based on research, but a feeling and a trend that has to do with this consent-based law, and as well a side effect of Me Too, and that is seeing younger women in particular pressing charges, types of rapes we 5 years ago didn't necessarily see entering the system. So in that sense, I think maybe the stigma of a case being dropped is not as big of a hurdle as it was. In Iceland, the scenario is that the cases that do lead to prosecution have a very high conviction rate, I think around 70–75%. What happens before is the problem, that investigations stop by police, cases are dropped by prosecution because of not reaching the hurdle of likely to be found guilty. But like I said, this shift in the discussion of how you interrogate, for instance, with a focus on how did you experience yes in these circumstances. It's a much more healthy approach, and it has to do with laws, of course, but also the language and the views out in the society of what rape means. So I think we're altering the understanding and conception of what rape means by looking at yes rather than no.
So if you wanted to respond.
Yeah, because you were talking about more girls reporting the rapes. And since you changed the law, I was thinking that they also recognize themselves and their situation better in the laws, because we had cases where the victims were like, this is not what happened. I can't see myself in this. So I think, yeah, do you know what I mean? Yeah. there was just a...
Because the views out in society are not only the views by judges and police, they are with all of us.
Yeah.
So it's also part of recognizing yourself. What happened to me? When we have these old words of what rape means, to also give a different and newer approach for victims.
Joe, like what is happening also in the other Scandinavian countries and the changing of the approach, is that also something that, you know, lives in Norway, that there's more pressure to change the perspective? Or is there also the societal movement as we have seen in some other countries?
Yeah, there is a pressure from outside, from our neighbors, and also from people in Norway. But it's interesting, you're talking about not saying no, as opposed to saying yes. And I'm not just a lawyer, I'm also a father, and I have 2 girls, 17 and 20. So I think this has to do with sexual integrity. So one thing that I keep telling my girls is that you own your own body, and it is also a responsibility to always try to feel and determine what is okay and what is not okay, and to be clear and to actually say no. So as a father, I tell my girls to say no, to say, it goes for everything in life, to say what kind of movie you want to go to. Don't just go along with the others. Say what you want. And if you are with a boy, say no and be clear. That is very interesting. And with regard to the discussion, I think it's very polarized. So on the one hand, you have people very positive towards amending the legislation to a consent-based definition of rape. And on the other hand, you have people against it. And I think there is a difference between age groups. Myself belonging to a higher up age group. So to me, the most interesting is the fact that young people today really consider it rape if you have sex without consent. But of course, to prove the lack of consent, because actually it's not for the perpetrator. I mean, in Sweden, in Iceland, Denmark, it's not for the perpetrator to prove that there was a consent.
No.
It's still for the prosecutor to prove the lack of consent. So I don't think it's...
And that takes us back to the old...
Exactly.
Of how do you prove intent? How do you prove there was no consent? Then you look at the circumstances. Was there coercion? The totality of the circumstances, and how can you prove there was no consent? And it's usually, and that's what I meant by, of course, these terms, they all interact.
Yeah.
I also want to mention an important point, because I saw that in Sweden, when they changed, maybe also in Iceland, when they changed the legislation, they dropped the minimum punishment. In Norway, the minimum punishment for rape is 3 years. 3 years.
Oh.
Yes, minimum. So I think if you change the legislation to also include non-consensual sex, then 3 years is very high, and I think... And also in Norway, we have lay judges. We have judges that are professional lawyers, but we also have judges from, the people. And we just had a case in the appeals court where a man was convicted of 10 rapes in the city court. And in the appeals court, the lay judges said it was not proven beyond reasonable doubt. And I think the fact that it's a 3-year, well, 10 rapes, so he should have 3 years or even more. But I think there is a reluctance to convict people because the minimum punishment is maybe too high. It's higher than in Sweden now.
Yeah.
Higher than Iceland.
Higher than Iceland also.
Because indeed, it's something that we are talking about as well, that it's not just a definition of rape, it's the way of questioning by police as well. It is how prosecutors look at it, judges look at it. And for example, in Belgium, since 2 years, every judge, every prosecutor needs to follow some education as to sexual violence and domestic violence, where also victims come to talk. Ida, in Sweden, there was also, you also educate layman judges, or juror judges, as I understood. Maybe you can expand on that as well.
I don't know how to raise my hand. I tried many times because I have so much to say about all the other things. I just want to reply on some of the things that was said before I go into that. Like for me to hear now, when we have the consent-based law and the climate in Sweden, sexual act without consent. It's like, I think everyone in Sweden would like, what do you mean? What is that? It's rape. Sexual act without consent. It's just like error in my head. And also we had the debate about, in Sweden it's also våldtäkt, means like violence. And we discussed, should we change the name so it the norms like set even in the name, so it's not people are like misunderstanding that. But we then decided to talk about that violence is more, it's physical and psychic, it's economical and whatever. So we have to show that also to not get consent is one form of violence. We didn't want to take away violence from that because it is violence. And you, Martin, talked about talking with your daughters, and in Sweden we like always had that discussion that we have to learn. We have Swedish like self-defense. Like I have a quote. It's not so good in English, but it works better in Swedish. But we have to go from female self-defense to man self-awareness or something like that. Like we have to talk with the boys about this because we always focus on the girls. Like in schools, when girls do self-defense to learn to say no, like the guys could go off earlier. So we also started something called globalguytalk.com, in Swedish called Killmiddag, to get guys to talk about this, to know their own limits and also then to know other person's limits and to search for the yes. So like talk to the sons is like even more important. Like girls, we know not to talk to strangers and everything like that. We heard that all the times. We know that we should say no, but no is by research also one of the hardest words to say. So that's why we have to change the perspective also in the consent culture, how we talk with boys. So, and also like, yeah, it's still up to the one to show that there was no consent, like the one that filed charges. But in the big change is before the victim had to explain how she did resistance, how she said no. And if she was in frozen fright position, for example, then she couldn't say that. Now they take that into account. So it's been an extended criminal area. And the question had to go to the one that are filed charges against, like, how did you get consent? And if they can't answer that in a good way, usually the answer shows like, no, I don't know, she didn't say no, she was just lying there. Okay, then it's rape. So it's very important with this shift, even though it's always up to the one that filed charges to prove that a rape has been made. Okay, sorry, I had to say that.
Sure.
But so your question now was the juries, we educate them, FATA educate them, but that was also a big debate about neutrality. What is the name? Like the objectivity, that they weren't objective if they got knowledge about sexual violence. And in what other area do they say that you are not objective if you get knowledge? We didn't make anything up. We showed the statistics, we showed how the media talks about this, everything that was there that forms us, that forms jury members. So they have that, and when they make their decisions. But now we are still doing it. We won that struggle, but we want also the whole chain to like the judges, the lawyers, the police, everyone to be educated, but we're not there yet.
Thorbjorg and Joy, you both wanted to respond.
Yeah, but I just wanted to add the point of we are discussing laws, but in a good world, the law should of course reflect the views in society, and it should even be used as a tool to push these views or alter these views in a good way, of course. And in all of this discussion about no or yes, I think we should sometimes keep in mind, like, how do we say no in daily life communications? We don't say no very much. when you meet an old classmate that you didn't like when you were with him in the law department or her, and she says, we should meet for coffee soon. And you say, let's do that someday. And then you don't, because you didn't want to. We don't say when she says, let's go and meet for coffee. No, I don't want to meet you for coffee. That's just not how we are brought up. So a very, and this has to do with the same, it's the same here. Of course, like you mentioned, we, as a prosecutor or as a judge or as a police officer investigating this crime, it's not enough to just focus strictly on yes, because you have to prove. The defendant is not there to prove that he is innocent. It's the other way around. And that comes to the point of intent. And intent is often missing in the public discussion of that is a major impact, of course, in these investigations and a major hurdle for the cases. And I think maybe that could be our next focus point on how we educate, not just on yes or on no, but reading into circumstances and also for the people within the system of how you interpret intent. Yeah. I once read an article that basically had the point of like, how stupid are you allowed to be? Yeah. as a defendant in these cases, when like I had no idea because you didn't, and then whatever. The final point would be what we talked about: more women and more younger women pressing charges as a, I think, result of a newer definition on rape, has to do with what I saw so many times in these cases, that you want conviction because conviction reflects recognition of you being violated. But these cases, at least in Iceland, and I think this is a universal thing, they are convictions of rape are almost never because of the defendant has accepted his crime. No. Never. It's based on evidence, testimonies by others, testimonies by the witness. So even if the success stories within the criminal court system or criminal justice system, the victim stands still with a recognition by then the system, but not by the perpetrator. And some solution of this would be, I think, a major win for society, but also victims.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a very important point. The hard edges of criminal law is, of course, it's guilty or not guilty, and there's nothing in between to start a discussion on responsibility and mediation, and that makes it very difficult. Joe, you wanted to react as well? Huh?
Yes, I have a couple of thoughts in my head. The first one is that if you take a situation, it's a party, a boy and a girl, they are downstairs in a party and then they go upstairs. This is the typical situation that we are talking about. We are not talking about the mad guy jumping out from the woods, because that is a classic rape. This is something else. And let's say the perpetrator understands that the other person does not want to have sex. But there is sex still. So this is felt as a rape by the other person, the victim, because that is what young people tell me in school. They see it as rape. But because, let's say, she most typically it's the girl, did not make any physical resistance, it is not rape. So people will ask her, why didn't you not make physical resistance? Then it would have been rape. And I think it's grotesque to say that you have to make physical resistance. Otherwise, it's like a person coming into my house. Is it not a crime even if I don't physically try to stop him? A foreign, an unknown person entering into my house. Do I have to physically try to stop the person in order to make it a crime? No. So I think that's one point. The other point is from a criminal lawyer's perspective. I think criminal law is not the solution to everything, But I think it has a very important symbolic effect. And I think if you bring criminal law to the classrooms and say this is rape, you can be punished, and you can show students a criminal law provision saying, consent-based. It can make it's a vocabulary very well suited for discussion, also among young people in school. So I think in that sense, law is a very, very good starting point for a discussion.
Yeah, Turið, you wanted to?
Yeah, because you were talking about the guy jumping out from the bushes and naming that as the classical rape, and that's been like a huge focal point for us to debunk myths and stereotypes and making sure that people actually know what a rape is, so they can actually see themselves in the law. And even though they can't really see themselves in the law and the legislation, they know that something wrong has been made to them, and it was not their fault. It was just like on the myths.
Because
I also say something there.
Yeah, Ida, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, because I think it's about the intent. Like the Swedish legislation shifted in two ways to make it easy. Like the violence, threat of violence, or that the victim had to be a particularly vulnerable situation changed. So it's now based on consent. All of these other things are still there as well. And then on the other side, it was the intent. I don't know the English word, but it's when I Google Translate, say indifferent intent or something, that you don't care. You haven't checked so much if the person wanted to or not. And now that's shifted to negligence. So like to say, before you could say, I didn't know that she was under 15. I didn't know that she was so drunk. I didn't see that she was sleeping. Now the legislation says it's your responsibility to see that she was awake, to see that she was over 15, to see that she wasn't so drunk that she couldn't say yes or no. So we have shifted in two ways in the legislation. And also about the symbolic effect, like when we started with the consent-based law, we thought it was mostly the symbolic effect. And the debate has made huge difference in Sweden. But then it's also showed that it can be an extended criminalized area, which actions are seen as rape and also have more convictions, except for more people pressing charges and stuff like that.
Yeah. Joe, you wanted to intervene?
Yeah, it's very interesting when you mention negligent rape, Ida. Because in Norway today, actually, we have a provision on negligent rape. It is almost never used, but when it is used, it's when the judge very clearly understands that it was intent, but it is so difficult to prove. So it's being used in a technical way. But it's interesting because when in Sweden, you got this consent-based definition of rape, at the same time you introduced negligent rape also together. In Norway, it's a big discussion. We cannot combine a consent-based rape and negligence. That is too strict. So you should have understood that the other person did not consent. Actually, in Denmark, when they adopted the new consent-based legislation, they got rid of negligent rape. So they had negligent rape, but when they introduced the consent-based definition of rape, then they said we cannot combine consent-based definition of rape with negligent rape. That is too strict. But in Sweden, it was different. So this is also a discussion now, and one of my students, she's writing a thesis on that particular matter, actually.
I would love to read that, because everyone in Sweden thought that the negligent rape was the one that's going to convict more people. Like they say, the consent paragraph is just there to set a new norm, but it's the negligence paragraph that's going to have people convicted. But it showed now that it's another way around, that we have very few convicted by the negligence paragraph and many by the consent paragraph. So in Sweden, everyone was like, we have to have a consent-based law, except like the heavy jurisdictional institutions. And they were the ones saying that, no, the thing that's going to make a difference is the negligence paragraph. And they were wrong.
Tove.
Yeah, I would like to add to this point, because when we were writing the bill about altering the definition of rape, taking up consent, we looked into Sweden, and I remembered also that I think as early as 2000 you had this type of rape in the Norwegian code. Of course, when you think about what rape meant in the old meaning, and then you add this word. I think in Norwegian it's uaktsom voldtekt. In Icelandic it would be nauðgun af gáleysi, almost like an accidental incident. It kind of goes against a little bit about how you see it. As a prosecutor, I would say, this is a tool you would like to have in the box, though. Yeah. Because this has to do also with how you interpret traditionally intent and what the burden of proof there is. So I agree with you when you say that probably used in the scenarios where the intent is, of course, there. That's a core element of the crime. But then it's a reality of the courtroom that you want to use this. But I'm not surprised that this is not much used. And I remember a Norwegian case law when I think a husband or an ex-husband was convicted of this type of rape because it was a household or a relationship very much based on constant physical violence. And then the culture of these relationships are often sex afterwards, like make-up sex. Of course, very much on the terms of the perpetrator. Yeah. In what position is a victim of physical abuse to say no or yes? This happens just as a part of the ongoing violence. So I think in a more modern approach to what intent means, we wouldn't need the other tool of negligence. But I can see how this is tempting to use, but not surprised to hear the outcome in Sweden, that of course that a fundamental victory is the word consent rather than negligence, and then we need to modernize how we prove intent, I think.
Yeah. And I think a lesson to take away as well from this panel is the importance of wording as well.
Yes.
And how that victims can find redemption or can be hurt by the use of a word, and how that has an impact on culture.
To someone to be convicted of
rape or negligence,
uaktsom gáleysi, it's not that's not perhaps necessarily the recognition you were aiming for.
Yeah, correct. We are already coming at the end of our going around of questions, and then we'll have questions of the floor. Just to wrap up, I wanted to give each of you the floor for, as we talked about, educate your boys, the importance of consent mainstreaming. So what is the one practice, good practice or lesson in your country that currently the country is doing to mainstream knowledge of consent, or of course your organization? Turið, I start with you. What is the one good practice that you say that this is what we can take away from the Faroe Islands?
I think it's the amount of awareness campaigning. Like you said, teaching the girls, teaching the boys about how to say no, how to respect each other, how to practice body autonomy, like in practice, how does that work? How do we communicate to each other? How do we recognize boundaries and limits? And this is something that you have to do all the time, because people are like coming of age all the time. Yes. So it has to be done all the time. I think that's what's been working really good for us.
Okay.
Thank
you. Joe, Norway, a good practice,
yes.
A lesson to learn from
when
Norway?
I went to school, I cannot remember one single time that we discussed with our teacher what to do and what not to do when you're with a girl. Nobody told me. Of course, I instinctively knew what was okay and not. So I think the good thing, and this is not perhaps particular for Norway, but I really like the fact that today these things are being discussed in school, because I think the earlier we start discussing these issues, the better. So the criminal law is not the solution, and there is a fruitful debate in Norway now. But I think still, as I just said, this debate in the classroom can be linked to the law. and you can use words as rape because it makes a certain impression. And that is why I think for many people it's so important to call it rape, to keep that word. Yes. But the discussion in school, it's wonderful. I think that students can discuss in classroom.
And
I
even
like
in
that.
kindergarten.
And even in kindergarten.
And start at that age.
Even better, even better. Yes, why not? Why not?
So, but the Icelandic
Good practice.
or lesson we can learn from Iceland.
Yeah, I mean, what I see as positive in Iceland now, and I think that has, when you look back, all the major reforms of legislations have been because of like active feminist movement. What I think is positive now is there is an open discussion about sexual violence in general, and we see now that the invisible victim is no longer so. The victim is stepping out and taking part in the discussion. But on a general note, and this has not happened in Iceland, I don't think it has happened in any of these countries, is the question of, I often battled with this in my profession as a prosecutor. You have crimes, murder, for instance, or importations of narcotics leading to much higher imprisonment than rape. In these cases, you sometimes get the defendant to admit to the crime, even if the evidence are not that obvious towards guilt. We discussed yesterday that the experience with rape cases, for instance, is when you get the confession, it's just like because you already have videotapes, DNA and everything, you don't even need the confession. Why is it that perpetrators of sexual violence and rape, for instance, don't find themselves able to admit to it? It's not the imprisonment, because we see it with other crimes. So that has to do with, I think, society and a cultural shift needed, that you don't see it as a perpetrator as a fate worse than death, confessing to rape. So I think we need something also, a shift in our culture and our societies of this can happen, and that we manage to then continue. Close the case with imprisonment or whatever solution there is. But the leading question is like, why is it that you can't confess to these crimes? And I think that has to do with attitudes and culture in our society. Stigma, yes, definitely.
And finally, Ida, I'm sure you want to talk about what you are doing as well in education.
Yeah, I just want to say also, like, everyone knows a victim, but no one knows a perpetrator, and that's doesn't add up. To every victim, there's a perpetrator. So yeah, that's also a debate in Sweden. Like, to have it's a heavy crime, but still we have to see that it could be anyone around us. One thing that's very good news in Sweden is that in the beginning of 2021, the government announced that sex education in school will change its name from the old sex och samlevnad. I don't even know the English translation. I think it's like sex and coexisting, because it's a very old word. And now it's going to be sexuality, consent, and relationship. So the curriculum is also being redesigned to improve the quality and strengthen the equivalence of teaching about sexuality, consent, and relationship. And it states that education should focus on what young people themselves want, such as contributing to the creation of a culture of consent where sex is based on mutual willingness and sexual harassment is not normalized, and giving students the opportunity to develop a critical approach to how relationships and sexuality are portrayed in different media and context, for example, in pornography. And it's gonna change, the effect is coming this autumn. So the debate about pornography is big in Sweden and has been for the last years. And another very debated question is if consent can be bought, like the Sex Purchase Act. If we have the consent-based law that says if it's a rape if you don't have consent, and then you can pay yourself around the consent. in the Sex Purchase Act. So we convicted one sex buyer or rape buyer, as I like to call it, because we could show that the girl, she was like 18, 19, that he bought was a victim of trafficking for sexual exploitation. So that started a debate, like why that we should have the Sex Purchase Act inside the consent-based law as well. So that's two things.
Thank you very much. Then I'm very happy to open the floor for questions. Also, if you're following online, you can ask questions in the chat. And we have someone going around with the mic. Yes, Elena. Here in front.
Thank you very much. Is this working? Okay. And good morning. Thank you to all the panelists for the interesting points that you have made. And I don't really have even a question. I can't disagree with anything that you have said. Only set the record a little bit straight that in Finland we are not as advanced. I don't want to give that impression that we have everything regulated. The government gave a proposal for legislation only last month, but the discussion has been going on for a very long time, ever since Sweden. Again, we are following the example of Sweden, and I think that the Swedish Prime Minister at some point said that if there is no consent for sex, it's a crime. So that also woke up the discussion in Finland. This might take a while. Probably they have an intention of having the law enter into force next year. But as many people have said, it needs a lot of other changes also, attitude changes, changes from how the authorities are acting, how the police is acting, how the legal system is acting, and that might take a very long time. We have had very sort of on rape cases, we have had very prolonged processes, which sort of makes it more difficult for the victims, and many of them don't even want to go into that process because they would have to go through it over and over again. And I think that in Finland, it's with the new legislation, the proposal for the punishment goes up also from 1 to 2 years. So I don't know what kind of effect that would have. But I mean, we are not there yet. I'm ashamed to admit, because we are supposed to be very advanced in equality and all of that. But nobody's perfect. Thank you very much.
But it's interesting to see in so many countries something is actually moving, and Finland, Norway, Belgium. So it's clear that there is more discussion on that as well. Someone else? Yes. Okay.
You're closest, so I'll give it to you. Hi, thank you. Sorry. My name is Laura Boxberg. Greetings from the Finnish Cultural Institute, and I was very happy to hear all your comments. It was super interesting. Just one remark: I'm very happy that we're concentrating on youth and young people, but I have a faith in them. I think they will change the world, and it's very important work that we're doing. But actually, we have to also focus for us who have been here for longer. And for example, yesterday there was a huge case and debate in Finland when a woman of 85 stood up and said that she was almost raped in the 1990s by this very prominent famous person in Finland, and this whole belittling and horrible discussion that people participated, and so all the classical comments that why did you stand up then? Do you want to? I think do you now want to market your book or things like that? So I believe in youth, I believe in younger people, and I think it's very important, but we have to remember that the attitudes come from us, and we have to change that. I think that's the most important thing. Thank you.
I fully follow there, because as well, and it's in several countries, abuses that have been in church many years ago that now are being debated. And it's not so much a criminal debate always, but sometimes also an historical debate of awareness of what has happened and coming to terms. Very interesting, yes.
Hi, I just wanted to quickly share an experience from Denmark. My name is Helle, and I worked for Amnesty International for the last 10 years doing research on rape and human rights, currently, however, based in the European Parliament. So I think the biggest experience from working on rape and human rights and consent in Denmark was that it really took a long time, like we also heard from all the panelists, because actually Amnesty started 12 years ago advocating for a consent-based legislation in Denmark. And I mean, people thought we were crazy. And I mean, I don't have to tell you, but there was resistance from all kind of systems and groups in population. So I think what really made the change possible in Denmark, because there were a lot of setbacks, it was the very broad cooperation with survivor activists, feminist organizations, mainstream human rights organizations, and in the end, also a very, very broad coalition of political parties across party divides that supported this change. And now, only 1 year after a consent-based, I mean, there were so many barriers and stereotypes. I think the biggest being that in Denmark, there's really an understanding that we already have equality, so we don't really have to change laws or anything else. But also another barrier was that a lot of legal experts were saying that it won't make a difference. It will only be symbolic. And I was just coming from a debate now, actually, with my former colleagues in Amnesty Norway, debating the law there. And we can see in only 1 year that there has been a rise, 50% in reports and the same in charges. So there are very tangible results, but I think the biggest result is the cultural change we are already seeing now, and that we will continue to see over the, well, hopefully next decade. And of course, there are a lot of other things that still needs to change, like access to sexuality education and a lot of other things that can push for this change. But I just wanted to share. But thank you. It's wonderful to see you in the panel.
Toby, you wanted to respond
yes,
to that?
Because when you mentioned the point of this will only be symbolic, symbolic can also be practical. And you see that in the outcome of more victim pressing charges. But I've sometimes thought about, and this has to do with gender politics in general, that there's a higher burden of proof for results for us to implement changes. So by saying this is only symbolic, I guess we could look at many articles in the criminal code and come to the conclusion that the legislation regarding narcotica has not led to a society free of narcotica use. Still we have it. And people do drive drunk, although it's prohibited. So the law is only when it comes to sex offenses, we say like, will it work? Law will not prevent the crime, but I actually think that here with the symbolic code, it will be part of the prevention. And I can also, I wrote my master thesis in 2005, I'm a lawyer, about consent. And then I remember even hearing this from radical women, like, yes, it's a beautiful idea. And also someone mentioned here the prolonged processes. That has to do with politics. And if you are going to tackle sexual violence, of course, then you need to have the infrastructure for it. And it shouldn't take 3 or 4 years to go through, reporting and then waiting for an outcome. That adds a crime to the crime.
Yeah, absolutely, Joe.
I think the relationship between law and morality, ethics, is very complex, very interesting. 20, 30 years ago, there was a new law in Norway saying that you have to wear a seatbelt when you're driving. But nobody really cared about having a seatbelt. Oh, yeah, we have to do it. But today, you are considered crazy if you don't wear a seatbelt. And I think that started with the law. So today, people not only say it's not legal, but you are crazy if you don't have a seatbelt. So actually, in the long run, I think the law affects the morality and the perception of what is actually wrong. It has an educating effect, in a sense.
Thank you very much. On this note, and also looking at the time, we're going to conclude this panel and this breakfast seminar. I really want to thank all of our panelists for the very insightful experiences they shared from their countries. And it's very clear how lessons learned in one country inspire the other ones. So I hope that we can continue this conversation and then probably in 5 years we have the same one, and then Joe is here sitting and talking about the new legislation on consent in Norway. And the experiences there, and I really wanted to also thank everyone for coming out here. Continue the discussion over coffee and breakfast that is still here, and thank you very much.